what is the formula for a great villain? Like, I've seen analyzation videos or videos that kind of break down a few different villains, and they explain like the parts of a villain. Oh, a villain needs to be powerful and terrifying, and he needs to be able to inflict damage. It was like, he needs to have his own goal. I was like, okay, but what's the formula? I don't want to just know what the output should look like. I want to know what the formula is. And so that's the question that we're gonna be investigating today, is what is the villain's formula? Because that's how I think about story. I think about it as algebra. There's formulas for everything, and if you put in all the right inputs, one of the inputs being creativity and artistry, then out will come the correct answer, or an artistic answer. I don't know if there's correct, if that's a thing in art. So I think the first thing to approach, the first step, is we gotta understand how a villain fits into the larger story formula, and like, what is the function of a villain or an antagonist within a story? What are the things that they have to fulfill, that they have to do? I'm going to be pulling a lot from this book, The Anatomy of Story, because this has had the best exploration of like the fundamentals of story that I've ever read. It's a little bit mind-blowing reading this book. But so before we get to villains, I want to go over the groundwork that John Truby lays in this book about how to develop a story and how to develop a premise for a story, just so that we can kind of all be starting from the same place on, again, how does the villain fit into the entire story dynamic. Chapter 2 of this book is titled Premise, and so he starts taking us through his step-by-step process of creating a premise, where he thinks it starts, and the pieces of it. And about halfway through this process, we hit determine your best character. We hit the introduction of the protagonist in the development process. There's determine your best character as part of the process, get a sense of the central conflict, and then a little bit further down you get determine your hero's possible character change, and then figure out your hero's possible moral choice. So the first step is going to be developing your character out of the central conflict, because, and this is what John Truby is laying out, it is that the premise hangs on the hero. That is story. That's the way that it works. And so why John Truby starts with the premise is because you have to get it kind of right before you get too far into development. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in like revision mode, trying to like tweak and tweak and tweak and tweak to get the characters to where you want, that they're actually fulfilling the need that the story has. And so his philosophy is start the other way. You start with getting your character and their conflict right in the premise, and he has some guidelines on how to judge whether you've done that or not before you move on to other things. Kind of to sum up these 4 points is: who is the hero and why is he the hero? What is he fighting to achieve? Why is it important to him? And what is he struggling against, right? It's the central conflict, it's the change and the moral choice, and it all hangs on who is this character. So that's going to be the first part. The step 6 is get a sense of the central conflict, and understanding what it's actually about is going to be the key to your story. And so it's what is the battleground? That's the question. What are we actually fighting over? What is at stake? All those questions get wrapped up into what is the central conflict. And I think this is where a lot of writers can get kind of lost in incorporating theme into the stories. Stories aren't just simply presenting one idea or one thought about how to live. What they do is best is display a conflict. So there's core conflicts that we can all empathize with as humans, and it's what makes the stories, no matter how crazy or silly or epic, it's what continues to make them relatable, is these kind of core human conflicts. Dealing around core conflicts, having understanding of your conflict, and not just one thought about a conflict, but understanding the whole scope of the conflict, is the value that we as writers provide to the audience. Besides just entertaining them, actually portraying the conflict and outlining the conflict and showing ways to overcome the conflict, like, that is the value that we offer as writers. So conflicts involve a lot of different ideas, a lot of different perspectives, and a huge part of the development process for us as writers is to parse out from our ideas which ones actually belong as part of this conflict. It's not even just which ones are part of the conflict, because a lot of ideas will stack on top of each other and seemingly belong to a conflict, and that's what we have to parse out. Which ones are the fundamental ideas of the conflict, and which ones are just kind of the secondary and tertiary ideas having to do with those ideas. Does that make sense? And that's why the rule is get a sense of the central conflict here at the beginning of devising a premise. It's because you won't know. That's what development actually is the process of you not just getting a sense, but getting an understanding of the conflict and all the associating ideas. Does that make sense? So we need to get a sense here at the beginning to have a firm foundation that we're building everything else off of. But as we're building the characters, the plot, the structure, blah, 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 we're actually thinking through this conflict and seeing it from all the perspectives and getting down to what is the core conflict. What is at the bottom of this idea? Once we get there, it's building all the structure and the character and the plot and all of that to help communicate that idea effectively. One example of a movie not doing this well would be Snow White and the Huntsman. And this was one of the ones, the Queen Ravenna, the villain, was one of the villains that got voted on in the polls that I had put in the Homegrown Filmmaker group. And so I went back and watched this movie, and it was very interesting to watch. But basically what happens is the writers didn't understand the central conflict, and I think part of it is because it was being adapted from a fairy tale. And so you could kind of just steal the characters and the plot elements and put them together, and you wouldn't have to think through it all that much. You just take what's already there. So I don't think they took the time to truly understand what the conflict is. So the conflict for me on Snow White and the Huntsman was about feminine power, which was very interesting to watch a film that was made in this era, because it was kind of at the very beginning of all of the strong female character, strong female warrior trend that we're still going through and has led to not really anything great. But basically it pits these two characters as two different ideas of feminine power. So we get Queen Ravenna. She's manipulative, she's seductive, she's suspicious, she's filled with envy, misandry, which is, I recently learned this word, it's misogyny, but feminine misogyny. So prejudice and discrimination against men is what misandry is. And of course vanity, if the story of Snow White is who's the fairest of them all. But Queen Ravenna's character is basically, she hates men. She cannot stand being at the mercy of men, and that's her whole character. It's why she does what she does. She wants to be the queen. She wants to be the best, and it's this depiction of dark feminine power, of twisted feminine power, as opposed to masculine power, which you can think of as the archetypal leader, king, physical strength and authority sort of idea. And then we have Snow White, her whole character is purity, grace, compassion, inspiration, beauty, and nobility. And inspiration was really the one for me that was the power displayed in this film, that she doesn't, for the first half of the film, she's just kind of running away from Ravenna, and she's not really standing up, she's not doing anything. But the characters that come around her, because of who she is, full of purity and grace and compassion and beauty, and she gets to show, you know, those character traits throughout the story, they are inspired to rise up. They get hope. The men around her get hope to actually overthrow this evil queen and to escape from the oppression and enslavement that's happening in the land. And so that's the good feminine power, right? The ability to inspire the best from the men in our lives. And so it's like, it was there. They set up the characters this way. They display the characters for the first half of the film. But as soon as we get to the midway point, which is where she takes a bite of the apple and she falls asleep, the conflict just disappears. They didn't understand that that's what was at the bottom of it, because for the rest of the story, Snow White becomes, oh right, a masculine hero, right? She's the warrior princess. She's dressed up in armor and riding horses and swinging swords. And it's like, okay, you didn't understand what the conflict was about. I want to see how good feminine power overcomes bad feminine power. That's what the conflict was. And we just got hijacked by the beginnings of the female empowerment agenda in Hollywood. Oh, we can't have just all the men fighting and she just walks through, or however they would decide to end it. No, she's got to be the strong warrior. And so they just like, the plot just got hijacked on that. It does make me curious, like, what would the ending have been? And it must have been something around, so where's the idea that Ravenna, she sucks all of the beauty and life and vitality out of all the women. And so I would have got down to a point where she was going to do that to Snow White, and it doesn't work. You know, the positive feminine traits in Snow White actually protect her from having the life and the beauty and the youth sucked out of her. But you also want to think about the best of the feminine traits, like the way that she would see Ravenna, and you think about compassion being one of the driving feminine traits, and one of the, like, you think of moms being some of the most compassionate people in the world. It's like, oh, I can see Ravenna's pain. Compassion would actually win out the day. You'd have to figure out how to do that exactly. But anyway, this is an example. They did not understand what the conflict was, and so the plot just gets hijacked, and there's characters there who aren't doing anything, and the choices that the characters make are just kind of like arbitrary, because, okay, we're all gonna go fight the bad guy now. This is what I mean by understanding the core conflict, so that you don't get off track.